Welcome back to A Neighbor's Choice Radio. I'm David Gornoski, and we're joined now by a friend of the program. He's come on our podcast. I believe this is his first time on our live radio program, so we're happy to have with us the founder of FireInABottle.net. He is a pig farmer, a geneticist, a nutrition researcher, Brad Marshall. How you doing, sir?
Hey, I'm doing great. How are you?
Doing well. I wanted to have you on for a couple of things, primarily to talk about the link between seed oils and diabetes that you recently have talked about in a new article and video. I also wanted to get, first of all, your thoughts on the passing of Dr. Ray Peat. And, you and I had a few interactions with him on our show that we were able to have, and I treasure those now even more so how soon he's left since we did that.
Yeah, I think it was fortunate, our timing to kind of come along this trail, right, and to sort of discover Dr. Peat and the interesting things that he had to say, and somehow we managed to kind of overlap, right at the end of his journey. And yeah, that's pretty. Now that feels even more special, like you say. I think you're the one who tracked him down, and so I thank you for that, because he's not an easy guy to find.
Yeah, but we certainly had a wide-ranging and very interesting discussion, and I think you were in on two of those, both the panel we did about obesity, and then in our kind of exploration of the history of seed oils, and then getting into your similar perspectives on how seed oils and these vegetable oil products create obesity. And it was an interesting thing to see you guys have your interaction there, and I'm so glad that was able to happen. What do you think would be the legacy that we can build on and move forward on some of the insights that Dr. Ray Peat pioneered here in this space?
Well, Dr. Peat really was a trailblazer in pointing out the problems with consuming polyunsaturated fat, or PUFA, as it's called. He was out there doing it in the 1980s, kind of as a lone voice in the wilderness, sort of before anyone else was, and he wrote great essays and kind of alerted, a lot of the rest of us to the problem. Him and I sort of, one major area that Dr. Peat and I agree on, as we've talked about before, is the idea that seed oils, one of the problems with seed oils is they are causing reductive stress, which is kind of like, some people think of it as the opposite of oxidative stress, but in reality, I think it's the thing that's driving oxidative stress. And you see a lot of, people talking about oxidative stress and antioxidants and how that all comes together. And I think that seed oils are actually driving a lot of that. And it starts with reductive stress, and then later it becomes oxidative stress. And that is something that Dr. Peat and I really, very much agree on.
I recently just kind of changed the gears, but it's also in the same vein. I recently put out a tweet saying that, cigarettes are the sacrificial lamb for seed oils. And not that doesn't mean that cigarettes are healthy, but I think a lot of the things that we have been told by our government and advertising and so forth should be laid at the feet of cigarette and tobacco smoke actually may be more to be blamed at the feet of the high PUFA content and vegetable oils that are in so much of our junk food. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, it's funny. It's funny that's becoming more full circle. That's something that I've been sort of joking around with friends for like 20 years now, that I wouldn't have necessarily said that publicly. But yeah, I mean, very clearly, there's a complementarity between, right. If you eat a lot of things that are easily oxidized, and then, you engage in a behavior like smoking, which is a sort of pro-oxidant, you're going to have problems, right? And it's sort of like the if you build your house out of glass, maybe you shouldn't throw rocks. But, if you build your house out of bricks and you smoke, maybe it's not so bad. You know what I mean? And that I think I think the vegetable oils are really an amplifier of the problems caused by smoking. Is I guess, how I would say it. And certainly if you look back at the old data, like smoking on its own is a problem, but as seed oils went on, I think those problems were as the consumption of seed oils increased over the 20th century, I think the damage caused by, or seemingly caused by, cigarette smoking were really amplified as seed oil consumption increased.
Wow. Now let's turn to your blog now about this topic of diabetes. We're in the holiday season. People think about their loved ones. They think about if they've lost someone or if someone's suffering. They think about trying to avoid certain foods and sugars because they think, okay, that's how I, avoid diabetes or keep my diabetes under control. But you have a post out called Oxidized Seed Oils Cause Diabetes. And I just want to have you give your perspective as best as we can in a radio-friendly format as to what led you to conclude with that kind of statement.
Sure. So there are blood markers that, of course, that we can use, and people are familiar with, like cholesterol levels and CRP levels and things like that. But there are also blood markers that we can use to see what our enzymes are doing. And there's one there's an enzyme called D6D. It means delta 6 desaturase. It is an enzyme, and what it does is it takes, so linoleic acid is the main component of soybean oil, and when you consume it, it pretty much is linoleic acid until this enzyme gets a hold of it. And so once D6D, it's called a desaturase because it adds another unsaturated bond to linoleic acid, the main component of soybean oil. And after that happens, that kind of opens the Pandora's box. From there, that molecule of linoleic acid is, once D6D operates on it, it's free to become arachidonic acid. And then from there, arachidonic acid can become all sorts of, they call them there's different names, oxidized linoleic acid metabolites, prostaglandins, et cetera, et cetera. But all of these byproducts, what's really interesting is that if you look at, so there's a paper, there's a bunch of different papers, but a lot of them are out of Europe. And what they show is that, so you can look at the blood and you can see how active these enzymes are. And the way they do that is just, basically an enzyme takes A and it converts it to B. And so if you look in the blood, you say, okay, well, how much A is there and how much B is there? If the enzyme's really active, you're going to see more B and less A. And if the enzyme's not active, you're going to see more A and less B, right? And so that's what they can use these ratios of the before and after to tell how active the enzymes are. And in this study in Germany, they showed that if you had an active version of this enzyme that took linoleic acid and converted it to arachidonic acid so that it could be oxidized to all these downstream products, it increased your risk of diabetes by about 500%. That was in the kind of that was like in the most basic case. And then the statisticians get in there and they try to adjust it for like, all these other things like, are you obese? Do you have other problems? What's your income level? Like and even after the statisticians get done with it, there's still you're still 3 times as likely to get diabetes if you have a high level of activity of this enzyme that's converting the linoleic acid and sending it on its way to becoming oxidized linoleic acid. That's really the take-home message is the more of this linoleic acid that you convert to these oxidized linoleic acid, that is a very dramatic predictor of your likelihood of developing diabetes.
And so that's caused by a lifetime of eating vegetable oils, or can you get it strictly by theoretically not eating any vegetable oils, which hardly anyone does in America, but just eating chicken fat and pork fat, which is high in PUFA too, right?
Yeah, I mean, so what's interesting, I talk a lot about a Finnish paper from Finland, and so that paper was really interesting because it showed kind of the interaction between genetics and diet. The Finland diet, or the sort of normal diet of Finnish people, is interesting because they have not, to a large extent, introduced a lot of seed oils yet. They do eat some canola oil, but soybeans and sunflowers, which are the two main in the U.S., people mostly eat soybean oil. That's the main seed oil of choice, and in Europe it tends to be sunflower oil. But neither soybeans or sunflowers grow in Finland, right, which is very far north. And so canola oil, which is Canadian oil, which grows well in the north, is what they use in Finland. But even then, they don't use too much of it. They only use like 15 grams a day, and canola oil happens to be lower in linoleic acid than the other oils. Anyway, so just sort of by chance, the Finnish diet happens to be pretty low in linoleic acid. And so when they did the study, what they found out was that in the beginning of the study, the Finnish diet is low in linoleic acid. In Finland and in Northern Europe, they have very low rates of diabetes. And they didn't have a lot of these oxidized linoleic acid products. And there was two different groups of people. There was people with sort of good genetics and people with bad genetics. And, of course, the people with the bad genetics converted more of the linoleic acid in their diet to the oxidized linoleic acid. However, they took those people and they moved them to more like an American diet. And in that diet, they were getting like over 30 grams of linoleic acid per day, which would be about 300 calories worth of polyunsaturated fat, which is very similar to the American diet. And in both of those cases, whether or not people had the good or the bad genetics, when you go to that higher level of consumption, you ultimately have more of the oxidized, linoleic acid metabolites, the ones that predict diabetes risk, than anyone in the group on the normal, Finland diet of low PUFA consumption, regardless of whether or not you have good or bad genetics. Of course, the people with the bad genetics have even more oxidized, linoleic acid metabolites than the people with the good genes. But that paper is really interesting because it does show that there is a very real genetic difference between people and their, sort of propensity to convert, these vegetable oils or these seed oils into oxidized versions of themselves. But it also shows that absolutely the amount in your diet affects, the amount of sort of, I don't know, just call them raw or just normal seed oils in your diet definitely affects the downstream amount of these oxidized seed oils.
Do you know what percentage of like the population in Finland has diabetes, or did they give any statistics like that? That wasn't reported in that paper, but I looked it up. There's a thing called the Diabetes Atlas, and you can Google that and you can find it. And so I would say that the adult population of Finland has something around 5% of adults have diabetes. And that compares with, I think the number in the U.S. is around like 11 or 12% off the top of my head. And so, and when you look at in Europe, there's this strong correlation between countries like Spain eats a lot of sunflower oil. And I think they have a diabetes rate around 9 or 10%. So, approaching double
of the Norwegian countries where they have low, linoleic acid consumption.
Tucker and others and I have explored how linoleic acid, these seed oils, are also associated with increased risk of cardiovascular disease and cancer. I'm just curious, were you able to cross-tab look at some of those things to see if Finland had relatively very small percentage for cancer and heart disease and some of the other big, scary chronic diseases that seem to be associated theoretically with seed oil consumption?
I haven't looked at that specifically in Finland or in those countries. But what I will say is I do strongly believe that all of these, diabetes, obesity, heart disease, and probably cancer, at least most types of cancer. Cancer is a hard thing to make generalizations about because it's very kind of heterogeneous. But I do believe that all of those diseases have a common origin. And I do believe that, these oxidized seed, anything that has a, back up to that original study, and I'm talking about the EPIC Potsdam study that was done in Germany about diabetes risk, if anyone wants to Google it. And it's on my blog at fireinaBottle.net. But, whenever you see something that predicts a 500% increase in diabetes risk of being diagnosed of diabetes within the next 5 years, and your risk goes up by 500%, and all it is the activity level of one enzyme that's oxidizing linoleic acid. To me, that's sending off a lot of red flags, right? Like, there's not a lot of other things that would give you that huge of an increase in diabetes risk, as does that one blood reading of one enzyme, and all it's doing is oxidizing linoleic acid, right? And we're talking about a 500% increase in risk. And so that's like, that's big time, right? I'd be shocked if that's not correlated with heart disease, and a lot of types of cancer.
Yeah, it's so for layman's term, what do you think is actually happening there that allows these seed oils that become oxidized linoleic acid byproducts that end up causing diabetes? What do you think is the cascade effect? Do you have a simplified analogy or model for us?
Sure. And so what I see is that these oxidized seed oils become, they actually activate a lot of transcription factors. Sorry, that's a scientific word, but transcription factors are things that control the expression of other genes, and they're kind of like the body's master regulators. And there's a lot of transcription factors, and specifically, I mean PPAR gamma and the ARA hydrocarbon receptor, and don't worry about the names. But these oxidized seed oils are very bioactive. They're causing real things. And what they're doing ultimately, if you follow them down the rabbit hole far enough, is they're controlling some basic fundamental biological things like our ratio of NAD plus to NADH. And so NAD plus we need to run our metabolism. All of our food, carbohydrates, fats, alcohol, you name it, proteins, amino acids, they go through this thing called the Krebs cycle. That's how we use them to generate ATP. And the Krebs cycle is very reliant on a supply of NAD+. So our metabolic rate is essentially determined by the availability of NAD+. And these oxidized seed oils are triggering these transcription factors, and these transcription factors are lowering our NAD+ levels. And so when NAD+ goes down, sure, our metabolic rate drops, and that can predispose towards obesity and diabetes, but there's all kinds of enzymes, like there's sirtuins, if you've heard of them, but there's all these basic enzymes that are involved in. The sirtuins are very well known as being involved in longevity. So if you have high levels of these sirtuins, you see in animal models, the animals will live longer the more sirtuins they have, and that means availability of NAD+. And these oxidized seed oils are doing the opposite of that. These oxidized seed oils are getting rid of NAD+ and removing sirtuin activity, which is the exact opposite of what you see in longevity research. In longevity, you need NAD+ and you need sirtuins. And the seed oils are blocking those ultimately. And so, and that's what I mean when I say reductive stress. What I mean is not enough NAD+. And that's what Ray Peat and I sort of agreed on to bring it back to the origin of the discussion. Is what you see is, our NAD, which is NAD was in the first animal, or the first cell that evolved on Earth had NAD plus in it, and it used NAD plus and NADH to move electrons around. And that really is the basis of our whole metabolism. It's the basis of, all of our cellular processes is this ratio of NAD plus and NADH. And these oxidized seed oils are throwing that balance off. So at the end of the day, that's what I would say. That's how they're doing their damage, is by ultimately putting our NAD plus and NADH into this reductive stress, which is not what we want.
So do you have a proposed hypothetical solution for this if one has been eating seed oils and may be on the path to having this, if they have a genetic predisposition to have this outcome of diabetes?
Yeah, I mean, I've been working on a whole series on YouTube, actually. I have a new YouTube series called Obesity Explained on the Fire in a Bottle YouTube channel. And I'm actually really digging into this whole series of ideas and how to deal with these problems and what we can do and what causes them. So that's really the best place to look for my ideas, I suppose. I can't think of what there's a lot of things. I don't know what else are off the top of my head.
Well, you generally think, do you have a preference for low carb keto to help fight off diabetes, or do you think low fat, high sugar like Ray Peat is maybe a better way of staving off or healing or preventing diabetes?
I'm a little bit agnostic on that at this point, and I think it really depends so much on the individual, and because I know a lot of people that I can say, oh, you should go on the carnivore diet, and it doesn't work for their lifestyle, and they're not going to do it. And at the same time, I see a lot of people who, a low fat diet works great, and so I think that really depends on the individual.
Well, very good, Brad. I really appreciate you coming on the program. Thank you.
Thank you, David.
Check out very good. And check out fireinaBottle.net, where you can see his blog and can also learn more about his products at Firebrand Meats, right? Firebrandmeats.com. I think it's off, but fireinaBottle.net is the website for Brad Marshall to learn more about what he's doing. And it's been great having this time with you folks. I hope you've enjoyed the learning, the growing, the news analysis, and the information to improve your life. I'm David Gornoski. Godspeed.